Hi everybody, and welcome to another one of our discussion videos with one of the guest facilitators on the course, Dr. Maha Bali from the American University in Cairo, Egypt. And I've got her here to look through some of the questions that have been asked on the course so far, and see if there are any useful tips and answers that she has. Maha, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, thanks for having me, Andy, and hi to everyone who's taking the course. As Andy said, I work at the American University in Cairo. I work at somewhere called the Center for Learning and Teaching, which supports other professors in the way they teach. And my background is I have a PhD in education, but my undergraduate degree was in computer science, and my master's was in a master's of education in e-learning. And yeah, I publish generally in the area of higher education and educational technology, open education, that kind of thing.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for making the time to speak to us today. So I'm just going to go through some of the general questions that are asked on the course. And the first one is about probably one of the hot topics a couple of weeks ago, and that is plagiarism. So a lot of the questions are around how can I avoid plagiarism, and what tools can I use, and what should I be worried about, and what kind of tips and strategies can I use to overcome this problem?
Okay, so that's a really important question, and I think also something that perhaps not all of us get well trained on in schools or university undergraduate level. Um, and so the first thing I think is to try thinking about it not by first looking at tools, but by first just making sure you understand what it means not to plagiarize. So the first thing is just to think about the idea of citation first, so that what you're trying to do when you're writing an article is to show where some of the ideas come from if they're not your own. So to sort of acknowledge the person and attribute the person whose ideas they are, out of respect for that person, but also out of increasing your own credibility that this person said the same thing that you're trying to say and that you're building on the work of another person. So scholarship as a conversation that is going on over time and that you're building on conversations that already exist rather than coming out of the blue and talking about something that no one else has ever talked about before. It's fine if you are, but if you aren't, then you want to show the reader where this idea is coming from. If they're familiar with someone else's work, they'll know what conversation you're continuing. And if they're not familiar with that person's work and they want to know more details about the thing you're doing, then you go back, then they can go back and find it. So that's to me just the philosophy of it. And I mean, just imagine a situation where you've said an idea and you were one of the first people to say it, and then other people repeat it and they never attribute you for saying it. It's actually quite frustrating. And it feels like someone stole something from you. So just with that mindset, the idea is to try to avoid that. Now, plagiarism can be two things. You can take someone's idea and talk about it without referring to them, or you could take someone's words and not clarify that they are someone else's words. Usually when people talk about avoiding plagiarism, they mean the latter. They mean that they're not going to, that they're using someone's words without clarifying that it's someone else's words, and then they get caught for plagiarism by something like turnitin.com, which is a plagiarism checker. This one is actually quite, in my opinion, quite easy to overcome. The first thing is, it's something like 6 words in a row. If you're repeating 6 words in a row, that is usually considered plagiarism. And the solution to that is to put it between quotation marks and reference the person, the year, and the page number if it's APA citation or whatever the citation method is to cite it right then and there. What I think ends up happening with some researchers is that when you're taking notes as you read, you copy and paste things because it's so easy to do that, and you forget to note which parts are your own words and which parts are someone else's words. And to me, that's the key thing. So what I try to do is, if I'm doing that, then I'll have the reference that I'm copying things from somewhere, and I don't write any of my own words in that part, so that I know that all of this is cited in some way, and put the quotes there when you're using it, so that when you copy them, you copy them with their quotes, so you don't forget to do that. And then, obviously, if it's a large paragraph, you copy the entire paragraph, and usually most citation methods, you'd indent it. But the thing is that actually a better way of writing is not to quote too many things. If they're not really very beautifully written, you want to say it in your own words. The problem is that as a non-native speaker of English, The other thing that I found really useful sometimes is to do something completely different from the copy and paste. Is to read like I do this with books especially. So if I read an entire chapter, and I'll write my own notes about the chapter without looking at the chapter again. And that will distill the most important ideas out of it, because for the most part, most of the things you're citing, you don't want to cite every single thing the author said. You want to cite the general idea of what they're saying. So sometimes your notes should be already in your own words without looking at the chapter again while you do them, and that's going to help you avoid it. Now, one tool that is not a plagiarism detection tool, but that really helps me also, and I think helps some students, there's a tool called Hypothesis, which is an annotation tool. It's you can put the annotations publicly or privately, but one of the really nice things about it is that if you, for example, you're researching the topic of MOOCs, and you write, you're reading articles in several different places about MOOCs, and you're highlighting a paragraph or a sentence, and then you're putting your own comments on it. You could put a hashtag on each one of those for yourself, and then later do a search by your username and that hashtag. And what it'll do is it'll show you what the original text was, what your comment was. And it's very clear then which part was yours and which part came from the article. So when you come and copy them into your own writing, you'll know which part was written by the author originally and which one was written by you. And you could then easily decide whether you're going to copy the part, put it between quotes, or write your own words instead. So I think that helps a little bit. There's also all sorts of reference management systems, which I think we probably have another question where we're going to mention those. But like Mendeley and Zotero, which are free for the most part. They probably have paid versions, but for the most part, you can use them for free. They also allow you to annotate and keep things like that. That can, again, when you have the annotation, you don't have to copy and paste the text until you need it. And so you're less likely to make that mistake. Does that help?
Yeah, that's a really good answer. There's one part that I missed. I think the sound broke up. So just in case we didn't get it, there you started saying about tips as a non-native English speaker, and I didn't quite catch what you said.
Okay, so I was saying that, the idea is to try to say things in your own words as much as possible, rather than quote a lot or use the author's original words. And I understand that as a non-native speaker, sometimes you think the author has said it so well that you can't say it better. And the thing is, if you find yourself really trying to paraphrase something and you're only changing one or two words, or you're just switching the order of a sentence, that's still not okay. And if you can't do it, khalas, just keep it with the author's words if you really can't find a better way to do it. But the other, I don't know if that part came through, but the other part is try to not look at it at all when you're saying it. Unless you have a photographic memory, this should work out okay. Just not looking at it while you're trying to rephrase it will probably be all right. One of the funny things, though, sometimes is that if you take your notes not using the author's words, and then you think that your notes were the author's words, so you try to paraphrase your own words, you go back to the same words of the author, so be careful not to do that part.
I do that all the time, actually.
It's funny.
Yeah. Okay, that's a really good answer, and I'm really glad that you went down the route that you did about just making sure you understand what plagiarism is and how to cite correctly. Because a lot of the questions in the forums were, how can I find a free plagiarism checker? And I think you're right to say that you should focus first on how you cite and understanding what plagiarism is.
Can I add something there, though? You also need to
Yeah.
be, I think you need to be careful with using plagiarism checkers, because if I remember this was when I was finishing my PhD, I have access to Turnitin.com as part of my institution. And I think my university uses a plagiarism checker as well. And I checked with them which one they use, so that if I post mine on Turnitin and they use Turnitin, it's going to look like it's plagiarized. So you actually need to be quite careful with using plagiarism checkers, as you don't want to put it and then someone else will put the same one and then find that it's plagiarized. And plagiarism checkers are very, very tricky. They're very smart, but they're also very stupid. And so if you're not used to using one, you might confuse yourself.
Yes, yeah. You really do need to understand what it is that they do, because they give you quite an arbitrary number, a percentage, and that doesn't always tell you the true story. So it might say that you have 20% material, copied material, and that doesn't mean to say that 20% of the paper is plagiarized. It just means that there's material that's come from elsewhere.
Exactly.
And sometimes that can be things like methodology and factual information, which
Yes.
or data that you're using from elsewhere, which doesn't
Yes.
constitute actual plagiarism.
Yes.
So
And names of very long organizations when
yeah,
they're spelled out.
yeah,
And of course your references, but
mm,
Turnitin.com allows the person checking to remove the references, to remove the quotes, but like
mm,
indented quotes, it can't see indented quotes, for example,
yeah,
because they don't have quotation marks around them.
yeah. In fact, when we first started using the software ourselves, it was picking up on the things like the name of the journal and as you say, names of organizations. And unless you know how to tweak the settings to avoid that, it counts that as a certain percentage of plagiarism. So yeah, the machines, the software isn't that clever yet. Whilst we're on the subject of tools, I think you started mentioning some online tools and resources. So perhaps it's a good time to ask what online resources and digital tools you would recommend for researchers.
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, Hypothesis, because it's a very simple to use annotation tool and it has two big advantages. One of them is that you can just, any website, whether it's a PDF or a text type website, so whether the journal article is something you can access as a PDF or just read it on the web, you can just plug that in and start using Hypothesis right away. It's very easy to create the account. It doesn't ask for anything except your name and your email, so it's very fast. And then you can use it from anywhere and see your annotations on another computer at any time. And you can make it public or private, or you can create a private group so you and a few other people can see them. And you can also see, obviously, if it's public, then other people's public annotations you can see as well. So you can see what other people have been annotating about that article. And as I said earlier, you can search your annotations later and find them. The other really, really good thing about it is this PDF thing. It allows you to annotate offline PDFs. So you've downloaded the PDF on your computer. It's not online that you have a link to the PDF, but you've downloaded it. So, for example, it's from a database that is password protected and everything. But once you've downloaded it and you start using Hypothesis on it, you can still see those annotations somewhere else, even if you don't have access to that PDF right now. So that's really special. That there's apparently all the PDFs have like a common identifier, and Hypothesis knows that, so you can see that across different places. But other really good tools like Mendeley and Zotero, they're reference management systems, and I think they have also groups. So if you're working collaboratively with some other people, you can share what you're reading together. I think Mendeley used to allow you to upload some of your stuff and annotate it as well, and tag it. I think the tagging is really important. So when I was doing my PhD, I'd have some articles that I felt applied to 2 or 3 different topics that I was talking about in my PhD, and I'd have to put them in one folder. So I couldn't copy the same article in 3 different folders about topic A, B, and C, but actually that article is useful for topics A, B, and C. And in my future, like 10 years after my PhD, if I want to find articles about B, that article won't be there because I put it in folder A. But with Mendeley, with Hypothesis, you can have a tag, as many tags, I think, as you want on each article. So for example, if you're doing an article about gender inequality in educational technology, you can tag it with 3 or 4 different things: gender with inequality, with education, with educational technology. This is obvious because of the title, but if the title wasn't obvious, you want to tag some of the key things, the keywords that it has. Now, libraries don't have that problem because libraries do take the keywords. So when you're searching a database, you find it. But if you want to go back to articles that you've read yourself, you want to have your own system for tagging them so you can find them again when you're doing research again. Other useful tools, and I tend to see a lot of early career researchers familiar with the benefits of using things like academia.edu and ResearchGate to find communities of other researchers, to find research in certain topics, to find sometimes free versions of articles that are not supposed to be easily available for free. Um, and I don't know if everyone uses Google Scholar in the right way as well, because Google Scholar, apart from helping you search for articles that are definitely peer-reviewed, also helps you find, for example, other people who have cited the article that you're looking at, and helps you just extract the citation right away. Now, Mendeley and Zotero, again, will help you extract the citation and then sometimes plug them into a Word document and do the references for you. But I almost never trust any of those tools. They always mess a little bit of that up, but it helps to have something to start with. But with Google Scholar, I really especially appreciate the cited by, because you want to see if a paper has been cited often, if you're going to use it, and you also sometimes get extra references by seeing people who have cited something. Or if it's an old article, like 20 years ago, you want to see who's been citing them recently. So you get the more updated version of whatever exists there. And it also shows you so many different versions of an article that, again, if one of them is subscription-based, you might find an open access version and download it very easily. And another useful tool for, I hope it still works, called Citation Machine, to help you get your references in. You just enter, it tells you which fields you need to enter, and then it produces a citation for you. So that's also really helpful. And these are all free tools. There are tools that you pay for these kinds of things, but I think the free ones are almost as good for most purposes.
Great. Okay.
Did I miss
Yes.
any tools?
No, I think those are the good ones. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Great response. And moving on then to another common question, which is, how can I find an appropriate journal? So, what do you do when you're looking for an appropriate journal to publish your research in?
So that's a really good question, and it really is highly dependent on what it is you're doing, but I'm going to try to give useful examples here rather than just say it's contextual. The first thing is, what are the articles, when you are doing research about a particular topic and you're just researching it in general, you will find yourself probably finding a cluster of good articles on this topic in a couple of journals. It's very unlikely that a topic is being addressed in all the journals, or that all the good articles in it are addressed in all the journals, in the very generic um, journals. And the more specialized the journal, the better it is, and the better your chance of getting published in it, if that's what you're working on, than one of the very high end and maybe high impact factor, but very general journals, because then your chance as an early career researcher of doing something of that quality, I think, is probably lower. It probably takes a very long time to peer review. And you don't want to, you want to get a few publications under your belt if possible, if you're working alone, especially not with an experienced researcher, before you want to aim that high. And you also like I mean, I've had articles that got accepted really quickly. My first publication ever when I was still doing my master's took about a year to publish because I first submitted it to the wrong type of journal. So I'll give this example. It was a journal of chemical education that I submitted to, but it was about an e-learning thing that we did in a chemistry course. So I was co-authoring it with a chemistry professor who was teaching the course, but the whole article was about the e-learning thing that we did. And so the Journal of Chemical Education at the time said, actually, you guys probably better submit this to an e-learning article. They gave us the feedback. So we got the peer review and we improved it based on the peer review, but we went and submitted it to a journal that used to be called the Journal of Asynchronous Learning Networks. It's now called the Online Learning Journal. But anyway, so that journal, they gave us feedback, but it was the right place for it. And so it eventually got published there. And now I'm on the editorial board of the Online Learning Journal. So it was the right place, If you can see yourself eventually just doing more of that with that journal, then it makes sense. And, look at the references that you've got. If all of your references are e-learning, journal type references, then it's definitely got to belong to one of those journals. The other advantage of working with journals that you've read a lot from is that you know what kind of style they like. So there are journals about e-learning that mostly like quantitative research. So if you're doing a qualitative study, it's very unlikely that they're going to accept it. So just don't do that to yourself. Look at the editorial submission requirements very well. Some people are okay with things that are like opinion pieces or theory pieces, and some really need empirical research. So don't submit something that isn't empirical research to them. It's just a waste of everyone's time. And look at the editorial board, I think, sometimes as well. See the kinds of people who are on it. Are they people you recognize in the field? Are they big names in the field? Because if you are like me and you do a lot of cutting edge research, a lot of times, if this journal doesn't send it to a peer reviewer who understands, you're going to get really bad reviews because they don't understand what the heck you're doing. So you want to be in a place where you can imagine that the editor of the journal will understand whom to send your paper to for review. And that really matters. Um, um, the two other things that I think help you publish faster in a journal that is still credible. So you want to make sure that you're publishing in a credible journal, and even there are several ways to do that. Check if it's on something like Scopus, but with social science, they don't always have them on Scopus. Check if it's an open access journal. The directory of open access journals has vetted journals, so all the ones that are on there right now are vetted and they're credible. The two things that I've actually lost my line of thought for a second. Okay, yeah, two things to publish faster. One of them is if there's a special issue on a topic that you're interested in, this is a good thing to, usually there's a proposal process before you have to write the full paper, so you have an opportunity to write something short and quick, and if you're on the right track, they'll tell you that you're on the right track, and then you can submit a full paper later for review. And usually because it's a special issue, they want to publish it by a particular date. So they're going to want to get back to you on the peer review as early as possible so they can publish it faster. It's a lot of pressure on you, but also honestly, as a researcher with a lot of different deadlines on me, having a deadline is good because it makes you do it. The ones that don't have deadlines, you might find yourself just spending years on. So that's one thing. The other good thing about special issues, obviously, is that it gets published with other things in the same topic, and it's going to get read probably more because people who are interested in that field will read that article. And if you're lucky, maybe the editor will ask you to peer review another article that's being published in the same edition, and that's awesome because you can then cross-reference each other, and then you know what else is happening at the same time. The other thing to help publish faster is that certain journals have article types that are made especially for faster peer review, that are shorter, that have a shorter peer review process, that are made for early career researchers. And two of my early publications were in that type. So there's, for example, a journal called Teaching in Higher Education, and it has a section called Points for Departure that has its own editor, and they do a much faster peer review process. So it's really, it's helpful to get something published and get something out there, like for your own just morale, because I had another, there was one of my journal articles that was in a group, and it was very cutting edge that nobody really understood it, and I think we went through like six different journals and like 2 years until it got published, whereas some of my other stuff gets published within like 3-4 months, some of it within a year. Within a year is normal. It's not that long, because if you've been a peer reviewer, which is also a good thing to do, because as you peer review for journals, you start to understand what they want. If you're ever asked to volunteer to peer review, give it a chance until it becomes too much for you. You sort of start to understand what they're looking for, and you start to realize that it sometimes takes time to give a good peer review to someone. So it might take a couple of months to get around to it, and then a week to do it properly. Depends. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, no, that's good. There's one thing that you mentioned, which is becoming a peer reviewer. Do you have any tips on how you go about becoming a peer reviewer? Do you approach journals, or do you I don't know, what do you think?
Okay, so I can tell you my experience personally.
Okay.
So I've had several. There are certain journals, especially probably open access ones that are on OGS or OJS.system. So one journal is IRRODL. They just have, when you log in as an author, you also have the opportunity to say, I can be a peer reviewer and these are the fields that I'm able to peer review. So that's how they do it. And so then they start sending you stuff. If you don't have your PhD yet, they count you as a third reviewer, probably not the main two. But that's also fine. I think it's a good experience when you've had your master's but not your PhD yet. The other thing that I've had is I've seen actually some smaller journals have a call for editorial board members. Does anybody want to be an editorial board? I've had that once, and that was my first editorial board experience. But once you have one, it might be easier for other people to invite you. I'm not sure. But the other thing that happens to me a lot is that I submit to a journal and then the editor asks me to review one soon after. That happens to me a lot. And I think it's happened to me even in journals where they didn't accept my article, which is interesting. So it's not that it has to be a good article that you submitted or anything. Because they don't pay you to do the peer reviews, so they want to have a good network of people to review articles. But I think if it doesn't happen to you naturally that someone asks you to do it, I think if you're submitting to an article, you could just correspond with the editor. I always build relationships with editors of journals. Usually it's because I'm nagging, hey, did you get the peer review back? Did you get the peer review back? But you can also sort of, it's not like you're doing something illegal or unethical, but you're just, hey, by the way, I'd be willing to review an article on the same topic if you have one or whatever. And yeah. So those are the ways that I usually got to do that. Obviously, if your own institution has a journal in-house, you could actually offer to help out with editing or peer reviewing or whatever that is. My institution has an undergraduate research journal that I help out with now. I mean, I don't need to do that because I do a lot of it, but I wanted to encourage the undergraduate students in this case. So.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So moving on to some questions about writing itself, so writing activities. So a lot of the researchers that I've spoken to in the past say they have problems with writing in clear English or writing in concise English. So sometimes many researchers find themselves going over the word limit and want to cut their words down. So do you have any tips on that?
So let's start with cutting things down, because
Yeah.
there are two very broad strategies that I follow that I've seen with people. The first thing is when you write in a passive voice, it takes more words. So if the journal you're writing for accepts active voice, which a lot of social science journals do accept, that will automatically cut your words down. Just active voice, like I. So I did such and such, not such and such was done. And it doesn't sound like it's fewer words right now, but it generally helps a lot. And it also makes your writing clearer automatically because it's a normal sentence. Like this passive tense is just very weird to make elegant, in my opinion. And again, because social science research is usually written by someone who is very involved in the thing, and it's weird to remove yourself from it. So that's one. The second one is a trick that I do. Uh, Microsoft Word has a thing called summarize, and you can take an article and you say, I want to summarize it to X%, 30%, 50%, 70%. And there are different ways of making it work, but you can make it just highlight the key things. And what it does is it'll read your article and it'll see the things that seem to be relevant and it'll highlight them, and then it'll remove some of the others and think it's not important. Obviously, you don't do exactly what it says, but it does help you to realize that something, oh my God, I've said that like 3 times already. Or actually, I've used that sentence here, but I've never referred to it anywhere else. And so that's the second trick. But a more contextual thing that should help you make sure that your writing is relevant and clear and coherent is sometimes when we write a literature review, we include a lot of stuff in it that isn't really needed, and then we don't refer to it again in our discussion and conclusion. And if that's happening, then that means that stuff was not important enough. If you're never referring to it again at all, then maybe that doesn't need to be there. The other thing is sometimes you're citing, you're trying to make a point, and you say a lot of people have done this, and you cite like 10 people. Well, maybe just 3 people are enough. Or you can say, and this meta review or this literature review cites 10 people, but you don't have to say who the 10 people are. You can just cite the review and just clarify that it's a review. So that sort of helps reduce that. Um, what else? What else can you do to reduce word count? Sometimes, honestly, it's silly sometimes, but there are sometimes synonyms for a sentence. Like there's a way to, when you say it orally, you say it in longer words, but there's actually one word that says it instead of 3 words. So these are teeny weeny things you can do near the end. And someone once taught me this trick of hyphenating things that could be hyphenated, so it reduces a few words. So this is helpful for abstracts, where it's it's a difference between like 200 and 230 words or something. But for a longer article, it's the word summarize thing. And sometimes you have to be really ruthless and remove entire sections altogether. So if you're writing something that is reporting on qualitative research takes up a lot of space to write well. And you want to include a lot of quotes, and you want to include a lot of themes, and so on. And if you find that you're supposed to be submitting something that's 5,000 words and you're at 7,000, perhaps you actually need to write 2 different articles and just focus on one very specific thing in this article and something else in another article, and mention that there's a forthcoming article that will do the rest. So, for example, Um, if you're reporting on student and teacher data, perhaps you want to write one that's just on the student data and one that's just on the teacher data, or a particular dimension for both students and teachers in this article and another dimension in another article, if it turns out to be too many words. Do you have any other tricks?
Me? No, I wasn't even aware of the Microsoft Word summarize myself, actually.
Yeah, it's called auto summarize, I think.
Yeah,
And I don't know where you find it on the menu now, but it's there. Search for it.
yeah, brilliant. Okay, I'll have a look for that later because I have the problem that I write way too much. And that's a really good tip about the literature review and including too much, because I do that also. Um, Another question on writing in general. Actually, do you have any tips on collaborative writing? Because I know that you've been involved in lots of collaborative writing projects.
Yes, I have. It's tricky. So, because I recently had someone get really angry at me in a collaborative writing experience. But so technical tips is using something like Google Docs is really, really good because both you and the other, or you and however many people are editing can edit at the same time and comment on each other's work and contribute and add to it. And also, you can use this suggest changes thing so that you can show the other person what you've done instead of coloring it another color. It just does that automatically. And the key thing about all of this is to agree together on how you're going to proceed. Are you dividing it up? Are you all writing in the same space? Who's responsible for what part? Obviously, if you're doing research from scratch, that in itself needs to be discussed a lot. And you need to sort of review all the time. There are sometimes situations where one person who's a very dominant person takes over and then the others aren't necessarily happy with what they're doing. So you need to always be sure you've agreed on who's going to add the text where, how do we edit each other's work, do we suggest changes, who gets to accept a change, who, when someone puts a comment, who gets to resolve the comment. Because sometimes you put a comment and the person resolves it, but they haven't resolved the problem that you were pointing out, so it gets really tense in that sense. I also have this experience of when you do research with people who don't have a position in hierarchy with you, that it's a little bit less tense. But the problem is when you go to things like first authorship, it helps if you're collaborating with a group of people in several different things so that different people can be first authors on different projects, and to make sure that you agree with each other who's going to be first author and why, and what kind of responsibilities that person takes. So, for example, the corresponding author becomes the one who gets the peer review feedback, and then for me, that person becomes the one who has to act in a timely manner to peer review feedback versus the others who can contribute, but that first author has that extra responsibility, in my opinion. Um, and in some collaborative authoring, I've just been writing with the person. I know them well enough that I can just write with them on a Google document and finalize that way. But in other situations, you need to have a back channel to communicate, like either going through email or meeting, like we're meeting right now, to just discuss certain things to make sure that you agree with each other. Definitely for some relationships, you need the synchronous communication, and sometimes you need to hear each other's voice or see each other's facial expressions. I'm sorry, my video's off because I'm in the car, but I don't think this is one of those situations where you need to see my facial expression. Um, but yeah, because for some really bad misunderstandings can happen, and then if it's a professional situation, especially if it's a professional and friendship situation, you don't want to offend someone and then lose that for later. Um, I definitely know that if I've known someone longer and I've had lots of conversations with them, it becomes easier to write together. There's one of my first co-authors was someone who I exchanged a lot of emails with, and then we're like, hey, that could be an article that we've just been emailing about for a month, and it started out that way. Sometimes you want to find someone who has something in common with you, but a sufficiently different context that you can write and compare. There has to be something special that collaboration adds that you wouldn't have been able to write on your own. Because I've done a couple of articles where, oh, actually I could have just written that on my own, and then it becomes really annoying. You feel like that other person is sort of holding you back rather than helping you write a better article. It has to be an article that without that person would have been a different article. So think about that. Like, what's the addition of that? Obviously, if you're a junior person and you're invited to write with a more senior person, You need to be clear on expectations, like, are you doing most of the legwork? Are you doing most of the writing? What's their role? Are they mentoring you? Are you learning by doing this, or are they exploiting you? Are you okay to be exploited temporarily until you can stand on your 2 feet? Sometimes you're going to get published easier that way anyway. It's up to you, but just be aware of it and as early on as possible establish those and keep iterating. Like if you need to go back and talk to your authors, you can do that.
Okay, excellent. Good, some good stuff in there. Thank you. Another question I got for you, because I know that you're a very prolific writer, and I'm always admiring how often you write, particularly on your blog. So, how often do you write, and how do you motivate yourself to write, and what tips can you give if other writers that struggle with regular writing or writer's block?
Yeah. So the I write almost every day. I don't blog almost every day anymore because I have to write a lot of other stuff. But I learned while I was doing my PhD that you need to write every day. And writing every day, people, it seems daunting, but there's a couple of things to keep in mind, okay? One of them is you have thoughts in your head all the time. You think those thoughts are not worth writing down, but most of them are. And if you keep writing them down, eventually you'll be able to see them as something that you can do something with. You don't have to share your writing. If you're not comfortable sharing your writing, that's fine. I spent many years of my life writing privately for myself, sharing with few people. And this was like creative writing or academic writing or whatever. And I only started blogging right after I finished my PhD, um, which is weird because it's actually quite useful to blog during your PhD, but I didn't have the confidence to do that. And people who see me writing now can't imagine that I never, can't imagine what it was like before. But when I was working on my PhD, for example, dissertation, my PhD was just in the UK, so it was fully dissertation. There was nothing else but the dissertation. I wrote a lot of different things in a lot of different places, but as soon as I had a thought, I wrote it. When I had a baby, I couldn't do that all the time, but I kept thinking about the thing all the time. So that by the time I sat down to write it, I could write it very quickly. And that's the trick about writing quickly. It's not that you think quickly, it's that you think all the time, and then you sit and you write it in half an hour. Um,
Mm.
so some of my best blog posts took me like 2 minutes to write because I've been thinking about them for months. But then I knew what I wanted to say and I said it. Um, and um, and so in my dissertation, because I wrote so many things, not all of it eventually ended up in my thesis because, like we were saying, you have to cut down the words. But a lot of the stuff that I write that doesn't go into something gets into something else. I still use it for something else. I can publish it in a non-peer reviewed place as a summary of something, or I can use it to do something else in my work that isn't necessarily a writing piece, but something that I used to inspire me in something else. So I think trying to spend some time writing every day, it could be that you choose a particular time of day, or it could be just, for me, this having a place to write next to bed, because I get the best ideas just before I go to sleep. And this is why I don't sleep very well, because now you have your phone and it's very easy. You don't need to turn on the lights to start writing something. You just write it on your phone. Um, so that helps. Personally, for me, blogging is helpful because having an audience for your writing helps. It helps you think better. It helps me if I put out an idea that is not complete. And I know not everyone is comfortable with putting forward ideas that are not complete, but I'm comfortable doing that. If you are willing to do that, it can be really helpful because it opens up conversations. If you write something where you've already tied it up neatly, then it's more difficult for people to engage with you because okay, so you've already figured it out. What's where there's no space for me. But someone like Martin Weller, who's a really good blogger, often writes very messy things. And then by doing that, he gets lots of comments on his blogs because everybody's like thinking along. Oh yeah, that's a good question, you know. Um, and and I think contributing to writing in like in a discussion forum of a course, in a on Twitter if you're on Twitter, writing some stuff on Facebook for people to respond to, whatever space you're comfortable talking to other people, just writing even a paragraph or something every day will make a difference. Just making your thoughts. It also writing helps clarify your thoughts. Sometimes you think you know what you're thinking, but when you start writing it down, it expands. It morphs into something more. And the other thing also, which is really important, is that when you write regularly, you can go back and trace your thoughts to where they were a while ago, and see how your thoughts have progressed. And sometimes you've forgotten something you thought about before, and then, oh, now yeah, that's good that I've written about that. So now I can go back to that idea and develop it. Um, it also, I also, like, if you're working on a research project and you're reading articles, I think it's useful to just write something for yourself, reflecting on that article. So it's not just that you've just highlighted parts that are important or put some notes next to it, but something more holistic, like doing an annotated bibliography for yourself, like this article, this is what this article is about, so that when you go back to it, you remember what it was about without having to read all of it again. And that's writing too. And that writing is going to help you later write about that article without plagiarizing as well. Um,
Yes, thank you.
one
There are
thing,
so
one
many
thing that
tips there.
helps some people, but I've never tried, is writing groups. But I've never tried that, so I can't give a lot of advice on that.
Yes, there are lots of tips there that I need to take on board myself actually for my own writing. So thank you. That's really good. So moving on to, I think, probably one of our last questions, and it's about qualitative and quantitative methods. So one of the questions that was asked on our forums was, when should you use qualitative or quantitative methods? And does the population size make any difference to this?
Mm-hmm. Okay, but one of the problems with asking the question about quantitative and qualitative is that it shouldn't be the first or the second or the third or the fourth question you ask. So the first question you need to ask yourself is, what's your research philosophy? What's your research paradigm? So quantitative and qualitative can be used in different ways, and just qualitative does not tell me what kind of paradigm you are. So there is the natural sciences that are a positivist. They have a particular epistemology and ontology about the world, and that it can be measured in particular ways, and that measuring it in those particular ways is valid. And then there's the post-positivist, which recognizes that this doesn't work so well for social sciences, but tries to approximate that. And there's the interpretivist or constructivist approach that actually believes that the world looks different from different people's point of view. It's not an objective thing, it's subjective, and it's okay. And that trying to pretend otherwise is actually not good research. And then there's a critical perspective that recognizes that, yes, it's subjective, but there are things that people are not conscious of. So you need to be critical of taking what they tell you on face value. And though they usually would use qualitative methods, but they would use them in a different way than an interpretivist. And a post-positivist would use qualitative methods, but try to quantify them in the end. And then there's postmodern research approaches, which I'm not really sure how to describe them, because there's probably not just one way. So I won't talk about those. But um, the thing is, depending on your research paradigm, this will likely influence your own personal philosophy, and my personal philosophy is somewhere between interpretivist and critical research. So I believe that I want to listen to how people interpret their own world, and that I believe what something Gadamer said, which is all understanding is always already interpretation. So it's not about my interpretation as a researcher being more valuable than the subject's interpretation, the person I'm researching or observing or interviewing or whatever. They have an interpretation, I have mine, and we're working on them together. Um, and the research questions that you find interesting, the question that you pose will determine what methodology is going to help you answer that question. So for the most part, people with a certain research paradigm tend to ask questions differently than people with a different research paradigm. Some questions in social science, especially because this audience are social scientists, some questions in social sciences don't have a numerical answer. They're not looking for a numerical answer, um, and they need to go deep into describing a particular thing in order to understand it. So I'll give an example of critical thinking, which was my PhD research topic. I would easily find studies that do correlation analysis, and they tell you that students who do extracurricular activities tend to have better critical thinking than students who don't. And then when I was doing my research with particular students, I was realizing that actually it depends which extracurricular activity, and it depends how long you did it, and it depends what your role was in it. Were you a leader or a follower? What were you? So it makes a difference if you were doing an extracurricular activity where you went and did charity at a place versus if you were doing on the debate team, for example, right? And it also, obviously, critical thinking is a complex thing. So certain dimensions of critical thinking would be encouraged by doing theater versus other dimensions that would be encouraged by doing debate, so for my purposes, I realized that those studies came from a different paradigm than mine, and they were trying to do something different from mine. And how you assess the quality of your research and what you consider to be valid and valuable differs depending on your research paradigm. So Creswell and Miller have a really interesting table about qualitative research, in that if you're a post-positivist, you do certain things to make sure that your research is valid. But if you're an interpretivist, you do it differently. And if you're a critical researcher, you do it differently. So something like triangulation, for example, which is used by post-positivists, is like you're doing different research methods to try to make sure they all lead to the same answer. But in other research, what you're trying to do is thick description so that you understand it fully rather than try to say they're all saying the same thing. You want to recognize that maybe we're not going to all reach the same final conclusion, but you just want to show all the dimensions of something. And one researcher, Laurel Richardson, says something called crystallization, where she wants, and this is more of a post-structuralist type of thing, is that you want to show that something will look different when you look at it from different perspectives, not that you will find the same thing when you do it differently. So that's probably more than the person who asked that question wanted to know. Back to that question of sample sizes, definitely if you have a small sample size, quantitative research is probably not useful. Now, what's small and what's large, I guess, depends on the population you're building on. So just today, I was showing my students a research study, and I don't know if you've come across this, but it was going around on social media, and it was reported on the Washington Post about millions of Americans believe that chocolate milk comes from brown cows. You heard this one?
No, no, I didn't.
No, so that's really interesting. So people can research that and find out. But when they say millions of Americans think that, did they ask millions of Americans? They did some kind of survey, and 7% of people said that. And 7% of Americans is millions, but 7% of the people who answered, I don't know how many people answered the survey. I don't know how they asked the question on the survey, but obviously they didn't interview every single American to say that really that 7% is a representative. I don't know if it was a representative sample. They say it's representative. I don't know if representative means from different states. So that could be one person from each state, like 52 people, or representative as in farmers and non-farmers, because I'm sure every farmer knows that milk is always white. so I'm just wondering like how they did that study. So I think quantitative research needs to be done really well for it to be valid and good. And a lot of early career researchers who are not well trained in quantitative research do it really badly and tend to think that quantitative research is more valuable than qualitative research. But it's not the same in every field. In a field like education, it's less useful to say that something like flipped classrooms help learning than it is to say, in this course, teaching mathematics to 8-year-olds, this section of algebra taught in that way, in a flipped way, in this manner, was helpful. That is more useful for people to look at because then they can understand how to apply it in their own context. They'll see what they have in common, what they have different. If you just say flipped learning works, there are 100 different ways to do flipped learning. It's different probably in maths than in sciences, than in history, than in language learning, and you can't generalize about those things. And the generalization, even if it is good to convince policymakers or administrators, doesn't help the person who's a teacher on the ground. Sometimes the lived experience of the teacher with their students in their context is much more useful. And so even something as a methodology like case study research, there are different ways to do case study research. Some of it is post-positivist, some of it is interpretivist. You would go about it differently. You would go about analyzing an open-ended question on a survey differently, depending on whether you're coming from a post-positivist standpoint or an interpretivist standpoint.
Wow, that was an amazing answer to the question. Yeah, that's really good. Thank you. I think we're probably running out of time now. I don't know if it's worth. Is there any other questions that you think might lead on from any of these things that might be good to ask?
Do you mean any of the questions that were in the list, or just generally?
Was was there anything that you'd like to be asked?
Okay. Anything that I'd like to be asked? Wow.
So
There was a question. We talked about active and passive voice, but we
yes,
already clarified that, right? I don't think we need to talk
yeah,
about
but
it again.
you mentioned it and how useful it was to cut down the words. Is there anything else you wanted to say about that?
I was in a workshop about writing the other day, and some people were talking about how writing in the active voice made them feel vulnerable, like they suddenly had to own the ideas that beforehand they were separate from their writing. Um, and I think it might be a little bit, maybe it makes some people scary at first. For me, I refuse to write in the passive voice. But I think it does definitely put the responsibility on you as the researcher to own it. And I think in a lot of areas of social science, it's quite acceptable to do that, or required even to do that. And I think it helps you be more clear and helps you take more agency in your research. So I would encourage people to work on that. It might be that their former training got them used to not doing it. If they're sure that they've read articles in their fields that use active voice, I would encourage them to just say I, or if they're more than one person, we. Um,